Hello and welcome to the next and possibly last in our Esperanto 101 series. We're going to review the 16 rules from the original Unua Libro, first book of Esperanto, and we're going to make sure that we've covered everything in them. But first, one more tiny thing about participles that I didn't mention in the last video. Participles, when you're using them as part of verb tenses, are adjectives. They don't seem like adjectives because we feel they're part of the verb, but they are grammatically adjectives. They end in A and are adjectives. So if you're using a plural subject, you need to mark them as plural. All the sentences I invented for our demonstration of how to form complex tenses were singular, and that was a bit of a gap on my part. If you use a plural subject, you have to mark the participle as plural. So, he had seen is, or he has seen is li estas vidinta, but we have seen is ni estas vidintai. If you're saying vi, meaning a plural you, then again, vi estas vidintai, and they would be ili estas vidintai. So, if you're using a plural subject, just make sure you pluralize the participle as well. If you're using the participle as a normal adjective and not as part of an actual verb conjugation, then it needs to be plural and it needs to potentially have the accusative ending. Now, with the examples on the previous slide, the verb used is esti. You are seeing, you are wanting, or whatever the participle is. And so that's a predicate adjective, and so it does not take an accusative. But if it's the direct object of a transitive verb, then it does take an accusative ending potentially, just like any other adjective would. So in our example here, you can see that frastigita is going to take the plural ending because we've eaten multiple desserts, and it's going to take the accusative ending because it's the direct object of mangi, to eat. So, ĉu vi manĝis la frastigitajn dezertojn? Ĉu vi manĝis la frastigitajn dezertojn? All right. The 16 rules of Esperanto grammar. I'm not going to quote the full text of them from Unua Libro, although it's in the public domain, and it's perfectly cool if you do. We're just going to breeze through it a little bit more quickly than it would take to read them one by one. The first rule is there is no indefinite article. The definite article is la, and the definite article never changes for the gender of what it's describing, whether it's plural or not, or even whether it's nominative or accusative. So we've covered all of that about la. The second rule is the basics about nouns. You form a noun by adding o to the root. You add a j to form the plural. There are two cases, nominative and accusative. You add n to form the accusative. And the functions of what would be other grammatical cases in other languages are formed by using prepositions. So there's a grammatical case called the dative, which is for the indirect object. I give the ball to you. In English, we can do that by word order and not the preposition. We can say, I give you the ball. But if I put the ball first, then I have to use the preposition, I give the ball to you. In Esperanto, regardless of where you position it, the indirect object would take the preposition al. Mi donas la pilko, la pilkon, there we go again. Mi donas la pilkon al vi, I give the ball to you. there's a grammatical case called the genitive, which is used for possession, for linking things. You know, the man's wife, the boy's friend, and so forth. And as we know in Esperanto, you would do that using the preposition de. You know, la amico de la knabo, the friend of the boy. So anything that's a grammatical case other than the accusative is done with a preposition. The third rule is the parallel rule for adjectives. You form them by adding a to the root. Their numbers, singular or plural, and their case are formed by using nouns, or as noun. The third rule covers adjectives. You form them by adding a to the roots. Their singular or plural number are marked as with nouns, putting a j or not. Their case is marked as with nouns, putting an n if it's accusative. The comparative is formed with plea. The superlative is formed with play. And if you're going to say something is more than another, you say ol. The fourth rule contains the list of cardinal numbers: unu, du, tri, kvar, kvin, ses, sep, ok, now, dec, and cent and mil. It tells us that you form the ordinal form of a number by putting a on it, and then it gives you the preposition po for distribution and the affixes that we covered in the affixes video. Multiplicatives are formed with obl, so kvarobla is quadruple. Fractions are formed with on, so kvinono is 1/5. And distributive words are formed with op, so triopo is a triad. The fifth rule contains the list of personal pronouns: me, si, vi, li, she, ji, ni, ili, and then also the indefinite pronoun oni and the reflexive pronoun si. It mentions that the possessive forms of these are formed just like any other adjective, and that the accusative form, both of the possessive adjectives and of the pronouns, is formed as it is for nouns, by putting an n on them. The sixth rule tells us how to conjugate verbs. The verb does not inflect to indicate whether it's first, second, or third person. It does not inflect to indicate whether the subject is singular or plural. It does inflect to tell us that it's in the infinitive form, the past, present, or future, the conditional, or the imperative. It tells us how to form the 6 participles, the 3 actives and the 3 passives, as you see here, and as we covered in the complex verbs video. And it tells us how to form the passive voice by using esti and the passive participle, and that the correct pronoun to use for showing who is actually doing the action to someone in a passive construction is de. The 7th rule tells us how to form adverbs, that you can form them from roots by adding e, and that the comparison of them is as for adjectives. That is to say, using plea, play, and ol. The 8th rule is very simple. Prepositions use the nominative case of their nouns or pronouns, with the exception we covered in Rule 13, which is going to be the thing about direction. The 9th rule is also very simple. There are no silent letters. Every word is written exactly as it's pronounced. The 10th rule is just that the accent falls on the penultimate syllable of words. The 11th rule tells us how to form compound words, and it spells out that the principle of doghouse versus house dog is used. In other words, that the last word is the one that's most important for saying what the thing is. Is it a dog or a house? It's the last word in the sequence. And the rule also tells us that the affixes used, the grammatical affixes, are roots unto themselves as well. The 12th rule tells us that there ain't no double negatives. Sorry, I had to. So if you're using a word that implies nothingness, like nenio, nothing, or neniu, none of these, you should not also be using the negation word ne. Or if you're using neck, you may not want to be using ne, and so on. Don't use double negatives. The 13th rule says that if you're making an adverb of direction, or if you're using a prepositional phrase of direction, you need to use the accusative ending, unless the preposition contains direction in itself. So if you're using al or el, which are to and from, you don't need the accusative. But if you're saying he goes into the house, remember, you need to put the accusative ending on whatever it is that the preposition is governing, in this case, house. So, en la domo is in, en la domon is into. The 14th rule says that prepositions have narrowly defined ranges of meaning. You should not be using che, which means at in the sense of a place, to describe time, for example. If you need a preposition and no preposition seems to fit, you use the preposition ye. And if it's not confusing to do so, you can use the accusative case instead of using the preposition ye. The 15th rule is about the words that Zamenhof called foreign words. These are, again, words where most of the source languages, all the languages of Europe, have agreed that that thing is called a theater or a théâtre. So, since all of Europe has come to a consensus on this, you should just import that word into Esperanto without changing it, rather than making up a brand new one. But you should use the simplest possible word, bring it into the language, and then form all its derivatives from that Esperanto root, rather than deriving it in the way that the source languages do. So, having decided that the word for theater is teatro, you can then decide that theatrical is formed simply by turning that into an adjective, teatra. You don't need to put an ik or an al or any French or English suffixes like that on the word. It's teatra. And the 16th rule says how to use euphony. It says that you can drop the A in the article and you can drop the final O of a noun. You should write an apostrophe if you're using this in written form rather than spoken form, where you drop the vowel. And the accent of a noun will remain on the syllable that was accented before you dropped the O. And finally, we are done. Fin fine, ni finas. So that covers the 16 rules of Esperanto. So that, in theory, covers all of Esperanto grammar. But we've covered some things that those 16 rules don't really make clear. We've covered how to use relative pronouns to link clauses together, the whole who versus whom, kiu versus kiun thing. We've covered a number of conjunctions for linking sentences together. Importantly, we've covered the table of correlatives. It's such a big part of the language, it's a little bit odd to me that he didn't consider that part of the 16 rules, but it was in the Unua Libro and is, considered part of the fundamentals of the language. So I think we've covered a great deal of Esperanto grammar. I think this series can serve as a good reference for you if you're a beginner. I don't have a good set of vocabulary lessons. This is something we could look into making in the future if there's enough interest. But at this time, dankon pro la spektado, and good luck with Esperanto.